G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. Today we're continuing on in the book of Zechariah, and I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session. We're looking at Zechariah 12:1 to 13:9, just a recap of what we did in our last session. We've come through the restoration of Israel. There's a regathering of Israel as a result of redemption, as a shepherd whistles for his sheep, so Israel will recognize their true shepherd and respond. Zechariah did speak about the rejection of the true shepherd. He prophesies of a time in the future where the temple that they were currently restoring would be destroyed and the land would be devastated. And the reason for this devastation would be the rejection of the true shepherd. Now, this came about in AD 70, when, as Zechariah prophesied, their leaders would sell out the flock, Israel, to get rich, and their possessors, the Romans, would slaughter them. So this was a time when God had removed his mercy from Israel. Zechariah tells us why this took place. Zechariah himself takes on the role of a shepherd, and in this case, representing the Messiah. He takes two staves, two poles, two staves, beauty, representing graciousness, protection of the flock, and the other one was called bands, representing binding or keeping the flock together. He fed the flock of slaughter, representing all Israel, and the poor of the flock, representing the believing remnant. He says he cut off 3 shepherds in 1 month. And these 3 represented the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, for there was a mutual antagonism between them. So there was a separation of the people as a whole from the good shepherd. So that staff, beauty, was now broken, signifying that grace and protection was now removed from the flock. The unpardonable sin had been committed when they rejected the good shepherd, Messiah Jesus. Now, Zechariah tells us about the price of the good shepherd. It says, when it came time for the shepherd to be paid, they weighed 30 pieces of silver, the price of contempt. The price, that 30 pieces of silver is the price of a dead slave. Now here God speaks to Zechariah and says, cast it to the potter. Why? Because God says that he himself was being sold out for the price of a dead slave. Now, the other staff, bands, was now cut. The bond of brotherhood between Judah and Israel was now broken. And the unity of the Jews was broken, leading to civil strife, with the result that Jerusalem fell to the Romans and the Jews were scattered. And this was fulfilled in AD 70. Zechariah then goes on to speak of another shepherd coming after this, and this was the foolish shepherd. Now, he will have no care or concern for the flock at all. He will destroy the flock to become rich. Now, Zechariah plays this role to show that one will arise from Israel like this. And looking back into history, we see that this was a man called Simon Bar Kokhba. He was the first one after the true Messiah to be declared the Messiah by the rabbis. He neither watched over the flock or protected it. What happened was he brought further division between those who believed in Messiah and those who rejected him. And devastation now comes because of the rejection of the true shepherd and the acceptance of the foolish shepherd. And that ended the first burden of the word of Jehovah. That was what we did in the last session. Now we come to this session, and in this session, we're looking at the second burden of the word of Jehovah. And this covers from chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 14, verse 21. Now, this is the fourth and last major section in the book of Zechariah. As he now deals with the second burden of the word of Jehovah, we'll begin by summarizing the whole section before we move on to consider the details of it. In this passage, Zechariah deals with the final campaign against Israel, during which Israel is purged, she's saved, and she's redeemed from their enemies. And this is all followed by the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. So basically, chapters 12 to 14 provide more details about how the events of chapters 9 to 11 are going to be fulfilled. In chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, we have the campaign of Armageddon. There is a map for you again just to refresh your memories about the campaign of Armageddon. It's 8 stages, and they're all on that map for you on your notes. Now, verse 1, the burden of chapter 12, the burden of the word of Jehovah concerning Israel. Thus says Jehovah, who stretches forth the heavens and lays the foundation of the earth and forms the spirit of man within him. Now, in chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, dealing with the campaign of Armageddon, he describes the physical deliverance of Israel. First part of verse 1 begins with the second burden of the word of Jehovah, the burden of the word of Jehovah concerning Israel. So this is a message which concerns Israel in particular. He goes on in verse 1 and he deals with the God who is in control. And he describes himself in 3 ways. Jehovah, who stretches forth the heavens. So what does this mean? It means that he is the one who is in control of outer space. He lays the foundation of the earth. So he is the one who controls the physical earth and forms the spirit of man within him. So God is the one who controls human life. So here we have a description of the God who is in total control. What's the point of all this? Well, the point of this is because of who God is, the following prophecies will be fulfilled, and the events that they foretell will be accomplished. They will be done. In verses 2 to 3, we see the nations against Jerusalem. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of reeling unto all the peoples round about, and upon Judah also shall it be in the siege against Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. All that burden themselves with it shall be sore wounded, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. So in verses 2 to 3, he now deals with the nations that come against Jerusalem. And here he points out that Jerusalem will become 2 things to them. Behold, I'll make Jerusalem a cup of reeling unto all the peoples round about. The picture that we're seeing here is of Jerusalem becoming like a vast bowl around which all the nations gather in order to have a drink. And whenever the word cup is used symbolically, it is often a symbol of God's judgment. It symbolizes the wrath of God. And if you have a look into Psalm 75, verse 8, or Isaiah 51, 17, and 21 to 23, also Jeremiah 25, 15 to 16, and Jeremiah 51, 7. In all of those verses there, you will see that the cup has to do with judgment and the wrath of God. Jeremiah goes on to say, and upon Judah also shall it be in the siege against Jerusalem. So what this means here, that when Jerusalem is besieged by these armies of the world, Judah will feel it. Judah will be concerned. Note here that we see a distinction between Judah and Jerusalem. We'll see a little bit later why Zechariah has this distinction. In verse 3, not only will Jerusalem become a cup of reeling, but she'll become a burdensome stone. It shall come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. This means that it will become a stone far too heavy to lift. All that burden themselves with it shall be sore wounded. So any nation that tries to pick up the heavy stone that represents Jerusalem, as they pick it up, it will drop between their hands, leaving severe lacerations. And then he points out that the fact is, all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. every nation. During the campaign of Armageddon, all the nations under the Antichrist will come against Jerusalem. And we can see this in Joel chapter 3, verses 9 to 13. And later on, we'll see it also in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 to 2, where Zechariah again tells us there that I'll gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Now we see the physical deliverance of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, at that point when they all gather, in verses 4 to 9, we now have the physical deliverance of Judah and Jerusalem. In that day, verse 4, in that day, says Jehovah, I will smite every horse with terror and his rider with madness, and I'll open mine eyes upon the house of Judah, and I'll smite every horse of the peoples with blindness. So here in verse 4, he starts out by describing the judgment upon the horses. Now, this is a judgment upon all the military equipment. The timing of it is in that day. In other words, in the above mentioned war, the campaign, it's during the campaign of Armageddon, this judgment will come. He says, I will smite every horse with terror and his rider with madness. And then God will smite every horse of the peoples with blindness. So now, because they're terror-stricken and blind, and their riders also become mad themselves, these horses will run headlong to their own destruction. Now, under the Mosaic covenant, God said that these judgments would come upon the Jews for disobedience. And you can find that this is the very same thing, strike them with blindness. You can find this in Deuteronomy 28, verse 28. Deuteronomy 28, verse 28. So what God once pronounced upon the Jews, he will now pronounce upon the Gentiles because of their movement against the Jews. Now, here is the outworking of the principle of Genesis 12, verse 3. I'll bless them that bless you, and him that curses you will I curse. Then he goes on to say in verse 4, I'll open mine eyes upon the house of Judah. So while their enemy is blinded, God's eyes will be open as he looks upon Judah, not simply to see where they are, not merely to see how things are going with them, but to look out for their protection. He will keep his eyes upon them in order to protect them from the Gentile armies. Again, we see here again that there's a distinction here between Judah and Jerusalem. In verses 5 to 6, we have the energizing of the Jews of Judah. Verse 5, and the chieftains of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength in Jehovah of hosts their God. Verse 6, in that day will I make the chieftains of Judah like a pan of fire among wood, and like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they shall devour all the peoples round about, on the right hand and on the left. And they of Jerusalem shall yet again dwell in their own place, even in Jerusalem. So verse 5 describes the source of this energizing. He says, the chieftains of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength in Jehovah of hosts their God. So notice here, Judah's strength is in Jehovah, their strength. That is in Jehovah, Jerusalem's God. The picture here is of the Jews of Jerusalem forming one entity and the Jews of Judah forming another. The Jews of Judah who are away from Jerusalem, remember that they are in a place called Bozrah at this time, or Petra. Will be receiving moral and spiritual strength from the way in which the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem are withstanding the enemy. Now, in this future day, there'll be something similar. It'll be, remember the fight in Jerusalem. And once again, Judah and Jerusalem are distinguished. So the source of the moral strength for the Jewish army in Judah will be the stand the Jerusalem Jews take against the enemy, as well as coming from God. Verse 6 describes how this energizing will work. In that day, I will make the chieftains of Judah like a pan of fire among wood, and like a flaming torch among sheaves. So God will so energize the Jewish forces that they become like a flame of fire among the Gentiles that has become like dry wood. Fire applied to dry wood causes it to burn very quickly. A flame among dry sheaves will soon have the whole field alight. Now, there's going to be two results from this energizing. First, they shall devour all the peoples round about. So the Jewish forces will cause massive decimation among the enemy on the right hand and on the left. Now, second, and they of Jerusalem shall yet again dwell in their own place, even in Jerusalem. Ultimately, as a result of all this energizing, the Jerusalemites will be able to return and live in the city. And once again, Judah and Jerusalem are here distinguished. Now, to a certain degree, Judah will help in rescuing Jerusalem. By this energizing, the forces of the enemy will be further lacerated or cut. So Jerusalem will become a burdensome stone and a cup of reeling. Now in verse 7, Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem be not magnified above Judah. So here in verse 7, he promises that Judah will be saved. Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first. The fact that Judah is living in tents points out that they're not living in the land of Judah, which was their permanent abode. But this emphasizes that they're living in temporary dwellings outside the land. As we've seen before, most of the Jews who survive this period make their way down to the ancient city of Bozrah or Petra in southern Jordan. The point of this first phrase in verse 7 is to show that the Jews of Bozrah will be saved before God saves the Jews of Jerusalem. That is the reason why the prophet has been making the distinction between them throughout the passage. The fact that Messiah will come to save the Jews of Bozrah first is brought out by Micah, chapter 2, verse 13, and Habakkuk, chapter 3, verse 3. It's also pointed out in Isaiah 34, verses 1 to 7, and Isaiah 63, verses 1 to 6. The reason that God will save the tents of Judah first is so that two other groups would not be magnified above Judah. It says that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem not be magnified above Judah. So, for that reason, God will save the tents of Judah first. And verse 8 says, in that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of Jehovah before them. So here in verse 8, he discusses the energizing of the Jews of Jerusalem. First, he considered the Jews of Judah. Now he looks at the Jews of Jerusalem. And he points out that in that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he'll do it in two ways. First, the feeble among them in that day shall be as David. What does that mean? Well, it means that the weakest among the Jewish forces will fight like King David did. And second, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of Jehovah. So those who are the future Davids among the Jews will fight like the angel of Jehovah, who, as we see here in this verse, what this verse brings out is not just an ordinary angel, but it is God himself. The house of David, like God, like the angel of Jehovah. The angel of Jehovah is the second person of the Godhead. Now, he is the mighty one because in Isaiah chapter 37, verse 36, he once killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night. So that gives us some idea of the impact of this statement in relation to the Jewish forces in Jerusalem. Finally, in verse 9, we have the judgment of the Gentiles. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. At this point, God declares that he intends to destroy all the fighting forces of all the nations involved in the Armageddon campaign against Jerusalem. Once again, we see the principle of Genesis 12:3. I'll bless them that bless you, and I'll curse them that curse you. The order in which this judgment takes place is that God will first rescue the Jews in Bozrah or Petra. Bozrah is the Hebrew name, Petra the Greek name. And in doing this, he'll be destroying many of the armies there. This is the sixth stage of the campaign of Armageddon. Secondly, he will then rescue the Jews of Jerusalem, and this is the seventh stage of the campaign of Armageddon. So as a result, he will destroy the final portions of the armies just outside Jerusalem in the valley of Jehoshaphat. This destruction of all the nations that come against Jerusalem will comprise the sixth and seventh stages of the campaign of Armageddon. But before he can permanently and firmly destroy them, he must bring about Israel's national salvation. So first must come the national regeneration of Israel, and this brings us to the next section. Now, just to clarify something here for you, Zechariah is going to return to this theme of the campaign of Armageddon when we get to chapter 14, and then in chapter 14, we will see that Jerusalem will eventually fall to the Antichrist forces, not without great loss to the enemies. However, we'll see that later. Now, in chapter 12:10 to 13:1, this section here deals with the salvation and spiritual deliverance of Israel in two areas. Their mourning for the Messiah to return and the spiritual cleansing of Jerusalem. So here we see in 12:10 to chapter 13, verse 1, the salvation and spiritual deliverance of Israel. And I'll pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants, this is chapter 10, verse 10. And I'll pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. And they shall look unto me whom they have pierced. And they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddo. Verse 12, and the land shall mourn every family apart, the family of the house of David apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Nathan apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Levi apart, and their wives apart, the family of the Shimeites apart, and their wives apart, all the families that remain, every family apart, and their wives apart. So in chapter 12, verses 10 to 14, he deals with the mourning for the Messiah, beginning in verse 10 with the pleading for him to return. The cause of Israel's pleading will be, I will pour the spirit of grace and supplication. So the Holy Spirit will be poured out upon the entire nation. He'll be poured out as an outpouring of grace, and the grace of God is what leads to salvation. Furthermore, it's also going to include supplication, because the grace of God will move upon them to turn to God and plead for their salvation and for Messiah's return. This outpouring of the Spirit upon Israel resulting in Israel's salvation is also brought out in Isaiah 32 verses 13 to 20 and Isaiah 44 verses 3 to 5. Joel chapter 2 verse 28 to 32 and Acts 12 16 to 21. Now, there are two groups upon whom the Spirit is going to fall. Upon the house of David, or the royal house, and second, upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So it is this that will result in their looking unto me whom they have pierced. And the word here for pierced is a word dakar, D-A-Q-A-R, and it means to be thrust through. And this is a reference to the spear which pierced Jesus' side, recorded in John 19, verse 37. So the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem is going to result in them looking onto the one whom they have pierced. Unfortunately, some translations have shall look upon me, implying that Messiah first comes, and once they've seen him, they'll repent. But that's not what the Hebrew means. The Hebrew word al means onto, because of where he is. He's not here, but he's aloft or he's on high. So they need to look onto him. So after they've looked onto him, this will result in their salvation, which results in his return. Because Israel's national salvation is the prerequisite for the second coming. And then he describes the mourning for the Messiah. And they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one who is in bitterness for his firstborn. This emphasizes the intensity with which their mourning will take place. In the world of that day, there was greater mourning for the loss of a firstborn son than for the loss of any other child. The mourning for the Messiah is not only a mourning for the loss, but also a mourning that this son might come back and be restored to life. This is the kind of mourning that the Jewish people will have for the Messiah. They'll mourn over the fact that Israel rejected his messiahship at the first coming, but they will also mourn that he might come back. Indeed, in this case, he will come back. In verse 11, he points out that this period of mourning will be like it was when King Josiah died. In that day, there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, and he compares it with the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddo. The mourning he's referring to is described in 2 Chronicles 35, verses 22 to 25, where there was a great mourning as a result of the death of the good King Josiah, the last of Jerusalem's righteous kings. King Josiah was killed in a war against the Egyptians at Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddo. Now, from that time on, there was a continuous downward spiral towards Jerusalem's own destruction. The national mourning for the Messiah will be like that time in the specific locality of Hadad Rimmon, where Josiah was killed in the valley of Megiddo. In verse 12, he describes the mourning of the royal house. First of all, generally, and the land shall mourn every family apart. So everybody's going to be mourning. Then second, he gets specific. The house of David apart and their wives apart. The house of David was the largest segment of the royal house. The house of Nathan apart and their wives apart. This was the least recognized line of the house of David, but it was from this son Nathan that Messiah came. Then in verse 13, he describes the mourning of the priestly house. The family of the house of Levi apart and their wives apart. House of Levi was the greatest in that tribe. Then the family of the Shimeites apart and their wives apart. Shimeites were the least recognized in the tribe of Levi. So these two verses describe the mourning in Israel from the greatest to the least in the royal house and also in the priestly house. Finally, in verse 14, he describes the mourning of the people. All the families that remain, every family apart and their wives apart. So the entire nation, and especially the whole city of Jerusalem, will go into intense mourning over the Messiah. Now we see the spiritual cleansing of Israel in chapter 13, verse 1. This national mourning and salvation leads to chapter 13:1, where we have the spiritual cleansing of Jerusalem. In that day, there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. When is it? It is in that day. This is also part of the Armageddon campaign. In that day, there shall be a fountain open. In the Old Testament, a fountain was the means of cleansing for ceremonial uncleanness. But here, it symbolizes the outpouring of the Holy Spirit through Messiah Jesus and their faith in him. And this will become available, he says, through the Spirit who was poured out. We saw this back in chapter 12, verse 10. This comes as a place of cleansing to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the purpose of this is to remove two types of problems. And here they are. First, for sin. Sin here refers to judicial guilt resulting from violation of the law, whether it's the Mosaic law or the law of the Messiah, requiring justification. As a result of this fountain of the Holy Spirit, Israel will be justified. Judicial guilt will be removed and they'll be declared righteous. And the second thing is for uncleanness. Now, this refers to moral guilt requiring sanctification. So as a result of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and of Israel's national salvation, when they look onto the Messiah, Israel as a nation will now be sanctified. So the Jewish people in that day will experience both justification and sanctification, both flowing from the blood of Christ, not from ceremonial sacrifices. In verses 2 to 6 of chapter 13, we see the spiritual cleansing of the land. And it shall come to pass in that day, says Jehovah of hosts, that I'll cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. And also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. And it shall come to pass that when any shall yet prophesy, then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of Jehovah. And his father and his mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. Verse 4. And it shall come to pass in that day that the prophets shall be ashamed, every one his vision, when he prophesies. Neither shall they wear a hairy mantle to deceive. But he shall say, I am no prophet, I am a tiller of the ground, for I have been made a bondman from my youth. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds between your arms? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Now in these verses 2 to 6, Zechariah describes the cleansing of the land, which will naturally follow the cleansing of the nation from sin and uncleanness. Verse 2 deals with the judgment against all sources of pollution. He starts out with the timing phrase, it shall come to pass in that day. That is, this will happen in conjunction with Israel's salvation. There is going to be a removal of three things in particular. First, I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land. So idolatry will be completely eradicated to the point, he says, where they shall no more be remembered, completely gone. Idolatry will be removed in its finality when the image of the Antichrist is destroyed, which we find in Daniel 12:11. That image was set up in the tribulation temple. Second, concerning false prophets, I'll cause the prophets to pass out of the land. Third, concerning demons, I'll cause the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. So all the sources of spiritual pollution, idolatry, false prophets, and demons will be cleansed out of the land. Now, during the Messianic kingdom, all demons will be confined in one of two places. Some will be confined in Babylon, and we find that in Isaiah 13, verses 21 to 22, Isaiah 13, 21 to 22, and Revelation 18, verse 2, Revelation 18, verse 2. And there'll be some others confined in Edom, which we find in Isaiah 34, verses 8 to 15, Isaiah 34, 8 to 15. Both of these places will be a continuously burning wasteland. Throughout the Messianic kingdom, all sources of spiritual pollution will be cleansed out of the land. Now, the rest of this section emphasizes the removal of false prophets. And verse 3 deals with the killing of the false prophets. It will take place in conjunction with Israel's national regeneration. It shall come to pass that when any shall yet prophesy, what this is here showing that the false prophets will continue to be in rebellion against God, even after the majority have come to realize the truth. Then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, you shall not live. So the parents of any false prophet will sentence him to death. And their reason is, for you speak lies in the name of Jehovah. And as a result, his father and mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. They'll execute him themselves, because their son is a false prophet. And the Hebrew word for thrust through here, which is used against a false prophet, this is the same word used of the Messiah earlier in chapter 12, verse 10. It's the same word that is translated pierced, where Jesus was pierced. And this is what the Old Testament required. False prophets were to be executed in accordance with Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 to 10, and Deuteronomy 18, verses 20 to 22. This is a real national transformation, because instead of being zealous for these sins of idolatry, false prophecy, and demonic activity, they will show themselves zealously against these very same sins after their national regeneration. Verses 4 to 6 then describe the hunt that will go on to flush out the false prophet. Verse 4 deals with the shame of the false prophets. Again, Zechariah points at the timing. It shall come to pass in that day. That is, it will happen in conjunction with the cleansing of the land and the destruction of the false prophets. The prophet shall be ashamed, every one of his vision when he prophesies. They will be ashamed because of their false prophecies did not come true. The lack of any fulfillment is always one of the key evidences that they are false prophets. Now, these very things are the evidence that they need to be executed. Neither shall they wear a hairy mantle to deceive. Often, true prophets would wear a hairy mantle, and false prophets would do the same so as to imitate a true prophet. The wearing of a hairy mantle was a mark of a prophet in the Old Testament, and we see this in 1 Kings 19:13, 2 Kings 1:8, 2:8, and 13. And we find it also in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 3, verse 4, and Mark chapter 1, verse 6. When they become ashamed of their prophecies and realize that they're being sought out to be executed, they'll discard the hairy mantle so that they'll not be seen as prophets any longer. And in verse 5 to 6, the section there concludes with a dialogue. Verse 5 points out that these false prophets, who once so readily claimed to be true prophets, are now going to deny that they were ever a prophet. But he will say, I'm no prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground. He'll claim that he had never been a prophet, but had been a farmer all the time. In fact, he says, for I have been made a bondman from my youth. So he claims to be not only a farmer, but someone who had been enslaved as a farm worker from the time that he was a young boy. It was a practice of false prophets, not only to imitate a true prophet by wearing a hairy mantle, but also to mark their bodies and cause scars. This is something true prophets never ever did. For example, in the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Baal cut themselves. We find it in 1 Kings 18, verse 28. In fact, they bloodied themselves. So in verse 6, we see how they will try to explain them away. And when anyone calls attention to them, as you're undergoing this interrogation procedure, the question will be raised, what are these wounds between your arms? Now, normally, these would have been a sure sign of a false prophet. Then shall he answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. He'll claim that it was done while he was fooling around in his friend's house and was wounded in the process. But such deceit will not succeed in deterring the searchers, and he'll find himself being executed. Sometimes this verse has been pulled out of context and been made to refer to Messiah. But remember, a text apart from its context is a pretext. Verse 6 is part of the context and the subject of false prophets that began with verse 2. It is part of the dialogue which began with verse 5. Therefore, verse 6 is not a reference to the Messiah, not to the true Messiah. It is a reference to the false prophets of the tribulation who will be executed at that time as part of the spiritual cleansing of the land. Now, in verses 7 to 9, we have the summary of Israel's relationship to the Messiah. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against a man that is my fellow, says Jehovah of hosts. Smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered, and I'll turn my hand upon the little ones. And it shall come to pass that in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but a 3rd part shall be left therein. And I'll bring the 3rd part into the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, Jehovah is my God. Now, before Zechariah proceeded with further details concerning the second coming and the establishment of the kingdom in chapter 14, he summarizes Israel's relationship to the Messiah. And in this summary, Zechariah made 3 points. The Messiah's rejection at his first coming, the result of his rejection, and the salvation of the Jewish remnant. In the first part of verse 7, he begins with the rejection of the Messiah. He starts out by saying, awake, O sword. The sword here is a symbol of death. It does not describe the manner of the execution, but rather it symbolizes death itself, pointing out that Messiah will be killed violently. This sword is to awake against my shepherd. By calling him the shepherd, God is emphasizing Messiah's humanity. And this is referring to the messianic shepherd Zechariah spoke about earlier in chapter 11, verses 4 to 14. But then he says, against the man that is my fellow, says Jehovah of hosts. By calling him the man, Messiah's humanity is again being emphasized. But where he's called my fellow or my companion, the Hebrew word is amiti, which literally means my equal. So this emphasizes his deity as Jehovah's equal. Literally, the passage reads, awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man that is my equal. For this one to be God's equal means that he must be God himself. Here is one Old Testament example of the God-man concept. The one who is going to be killed is the good shepherd, but he is also God and man. So this verse speaks of the rejection of the Messiah at his first coming, and the rejection was by means of a violent death, by means of crucifixion. Now in verses, the second part of verse 7 to 8, he deals with the results of his rejection. The rest of verse 7 is a summary of what the prophet said back in chapter 11, verses 4 to 14. Smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered. The shepherd was smitten in the year AD 30, and the flock was scattered in AD 70. Now, this passage is applied directly to the scattering of the disciples when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26, 31 to 32. Matthew 26, 31 to 32. But its primary reference is to the AD 70 dispersion. And he concludes this verse by saying, I will turn my hand upon the little ones. This means that even the innocent common people will suffer as a result of the rejection of the true shepherd by their leaders. So the first result of the smiting of the shepherd in AD 30 is the forced dispersion of the flock in AD 70. The second result of the smiting of the good shepherd is in verse 8, which is the death of 2/3 of the flock. It shall come to pass that in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die. Hebrew word eretz is the usual word for earth. So in all the land or all the earth, 2/3 of the Jewish people who are alive at the beginning of the tribulation will not survive to the end of it. They're going to be killed in the persecution. And this is described in Matthew 24, 15 to 28, Matthew 24, 15 to 28, and Revelation 12, 6 to 17. Revelation 12, 6 to 17. Now this verse ends with a promise, but the third shall be left therein. So 1/3 of the Jewish population is going to survive. This is the all Israel of Romans 11 that is going to be saved. This is the nation that is going to experience salvation. So in verse 9, he deals with the salvation of the surviving third, and he makes 3 statements about how they will come to salvation. First of all, I will bring the third part into the fire. Second, I will refine them as silver is refined. And third, I will try them as gold is tried. So the fires of the trial that will refine them are the judgments of the great tribulation. And you can also find this in Ezekiel 20, verses 30 to 38. Ezekiel 20, verses 30 to 38. By means of these judgments, they're going to learn righteousness and come to salvation. This is also brought out in 3 statements. First, they shall call on my name, and I will hear them. So the surviving remnant will turn to the Lord and call upon him in saving faith. Second, I will say, it is my people. Now, as the prophet Hosea mentioned, while the Jews are always God's people positionally, they only experience what it means when they are in a right relationship with him. And now the Jewish people become God's people again experientially. And third, they shall say, Jehovah is my God. So they'll accept God, and with the acceptance of the one true God will come the acceptance of the Jewish Messiah. And with that, we'll end. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.